If you rent in Ontario, you're going to want to watch this video. Hi everyone, Erman here, your Greater Ottawa Area real estate expert. I've been getting a lot of phone calls from past tenant clients of mine asking me similar questions. My landlord has increased my rent by $100. My landlord has increased my rent by X amount of dollars. Can they do this? And it's not a simple yes or no answer, so we're going to unpack this and more in this video. We're going to dive right in here and we'll switch over to the Ontario website for a residential rent increase. And we'll go through this together, and hopefully by the end of this video, I'll clarify some of your questions. So the rules for rent increase. In most cases, the rent for a residential unit can be increased in at least 12 months have passed since last rent increase or the date the tenancy begins. The landlord must give a tenant written notice of a rent increase in a proper form at least 90 days before it takes effect. So this is important for both tenants and landlords. Down here, it talks about what those forms are. And if you're a tenant and you believe your rent has been improperly raised, how you can dispute that with the landlord and tenant board. So they've also released the guidelines for 2024, and the rent increase for 2024 is 2.5%. So you might be asking yourself, well, how's my landlord increasing my rent by $100, $200? We'll get to that down here. The guideline is the maximum a landlord can increase most tenants' rent during a year without the approval of the landlord and tenant board. For most tenants, your rent can't go up by more than the rent increase guideline for every year. And then this applies to rental homes, apartments, basement apartments, condos, care homes, mobile homes, and land lease communities. Now, the guideline does not apply to the following. So there's a caveat in the rule, and this is where you might be affected. So this guideline, 2.5% for this year and every year, does not apply to new buildings, additions to existing buildings, and most new basement apartments that are occupied for the first time for residential purposes after November 15th, 2018. So if you're renting in a home and it was first occupied after November 15, 2018, these rent increase guidelines do not apply to you. So this is where landlords can come in and say, I need to increase the rent by $100, $200, and you might have even seen on the news where they're increasing by $500, $1,000, whatever it is, some ridiculous number. It also does not apply to rental units upon turnover of tenancy. So if one tenant is moving out and a new tenant is moving in, even if the home was first occupied before this date, they can set a new price for the new tenant. Now, just with everything else, there's always exceptions to every rule. So even if you fall under this rent control rule, in some cases, landlords can apply to the landlord and tenant board for approval to raise the rent by more than the rent increase guidelines. And if that gets approved, even though you might fall under rent control, they may be able to increase the rent by more if it's approved by the landlord and tenant board. And then how do we calculate the guidelines? It is calculated using the Ontario Consumer Price Index, a statistics Canada tool that measures inflation and economic conditions over a year. So that's where they come up. Every year this number changes, but it is capped at 2.5%. And so here's a simple calculation of rent increase. So your monthly rent is $1,000. Nobody's monthly rent is $1,000, but let's just use that as a simple number. When you sign a lease on June 1st, 2023, the guideline for 2024 is 2.5%, which we already talked about. So an increase of 2.5% on $1,000 is $25. So your new rent for 2024 will be $1,025. So your landlord can lawfully increase your rent payment 12 months later on June 1st, 2024. And that's very important because you moved in June 1st, 2023. So it has to be 12 months later. It can't be January 1st. So it would be up to $1,025 per month. And again, your landlord needs to provide you with written notice at least 90 days before June 1st in the proper form available for landlord and tenant boards. Well, that's all great, but what does that mean for you? Well, if you're currently living under non-rent control units and the landlord comes to you and says, I'm increasing the rent by any dollar amount that they want, legally, they can do this. However, if you've been there for a while and you have a good relationship with your landlord, reach out to them and try and have that conversation to find a happy median. And if you're becoming a new tenant or you're moving from one home to another, this is something you might want to take into account and, find homes that are rent controlled to avoid these types of problems. And the best way to avoid all of this is to buy your own home.